Welcome to Blakeney, one of the most delightful villages on the spectacular North Norfolk coast. Today a calm, quiet village, popular with tourists, you might be surprised to learn that Blakeney was historically one of the most prosperous trading ports on this stretch of coastline. And on this walk around the village on a beautifully sunny day, we'll delve into Blakeney's often unsung history, as we pass by relics of the village's medieval heyday, gaze out across the enchanting wilderness of Blakeney Point, stroll along the lengthy but almost silent high street, and admire the village's enormous 13th century parish church. All of that is to come over the next 20 minutes or so, as we make our way through the heart of Blakeney. But we begin our walk taking in a view over the River Gwent, which winds its way past the village's delightful seafront. Today dotted with small fishing boats, once upon a time you would have seen hundreds of much larger trading ships passing along this river, many of which came into port here at Blakeney after departing from the Netherlands across the North Sea. It's almost impossible to fathom that this was once such a major place of international trade, given how calm the village of Blakeney is today. But that was indeed once the case, and we'll explain more about the dramatic rise and fall of the port here a little later on in our walk. But just a few feet away from the river here, we find Blakeney's village sign, which features an eye-catching illustration that alludes to Blakeney's lengthy history. In the middle of the sign you'll notice a large galleon ship, which represents one of 3 local ships that sailed to fight off the Spanish Armada back in 1588. Other features of Blakeney's sign, meanwhile, refer to a few local legends. The boy with the fiddle on the left and the cliff with a cave on the right represent the story of a boy who attempted to fiddle his way to a nearby village through a tunnel. Although mysteriously, both he and the tunnel itself are said to have disappeared and never been seen again. There's plenty more local heritage to be found in the design of Blakeney's fetching village sign, which we'll discuss in more detail as we continue our walk through the village. But as we pass by a row of small boats on this riverside green, we're reminded of Blakeney's lengthy maritime history. The road that skirts alongside the river here is known as the Quay, and while the quay was once upon a time graced by much larger trading ships, today the River Gwent is home to a collection of smaller boats, which bob up and down on the water as they're moored against the shore. Some are of course fishing boats, while some are simply pleasure craft that allow visitors to the village to explore the surrounding wilderness in more detail. The natural landscape here being one of the biggest attractions for people coming to the village in the modern day. At the peak of summer, Blakeney can get quite busy with tourists, although even so, it always retains a quaint and calm atmosphere, the natural surroundings complemented by an array of fetching historic buildings dotted all over the village. The large building immediately to our right, for example, is a historic barn that dates back roughly 300 years to the late 17th or early 18th century, and which nowadays serves as an annex for the even larger Blakeney Hotel in front of us just here. Standing on a site once occupied by the historic Crown and Anchor Beer House, the Blakeney Hotel was built back in the early 1920s, and it today absolutely dominates this village's once thriving quay. The large hotel was only built as part of an effort by locals to diversify the village's economy after the historic trading industry had dried up, converting Blakeney into a sought-after holiday resort with plenty of places to stay and things to see and do. While the hotel itself offers some spectacular views over the quay here, and towards the Gwent estuary off in the distance, the village as a whole began to offer even more to visitors starting from the early 20th century, with a 9-hole golf course, boating excursions, and of course acres of boundless nature to explore. There's no longer a golf course here, but boating and nature remain among the most popular things to do in the modern village, particularly as Blakeney is famed as one of the best places in England to see colonies of wild seals. Blakeney Point, a little further out towards the coast from here, is the home of England's largest colony of grey seals. In fact, more than 4,000 seal pups are born on Blakeney Point every winter, The colder months of the year, usually the best time to see the seals. In the summer, meanwhile, Blakeney Point is usually busier with colonies of breeding birds, particularly terns, though you might be able to spot a seal or two if you're very lucky. And either way, a journey out towards Blakeney Point, whether it be on a boat from the quay here, or simply by walking through the sprawling nature reserve that we can see stretching out into the distance, is well worth it when visiting this village. Now, we won't have time to venture out into the nature reserve, though there's plenty more to see beyond the local wildlife out there, from imposing sand dunes to a historic lifeboat station, and even the ruins of a medieval-era monastery, which we'll talk more about later on. However, while the quay and the seaside are more often than not the main point of interest for people in Blakeney, let's now turn our attention to the streets of the village itself, which, as we can see here, is perched on a gentle slope that leads down towards the River Gwent. As we know, the village developed through the centuries around the port, which greeted trading ships from mainland Europe. And while we can actually draw a line back to a very small port that existed here back in the Roman era, the village that we know today really burst onto the scene in the medieval era. And just here, a few steps away from the quay, we'll find one of the last remaining relics of that most prosperous heyday. Just in front of us there stand the remains of Blakeney Guildhall, a historic building that's thought to have originally been built around 700 years ago, in the 14th century. An enchanting reminder of the historic significance of this village, Blakeney Guildhall is thought to have originally begun life as the house of a wealthy fish merchant, and the remains that we're looking at now are merely the undercroft of that house, which the merchant likely used as a place to store the fish that he sold. The building then came to be known as the Guildhall, a bit later on in history, as it served as the headquarters for Blakeney's Guild of Fish Merchants, an association of those with the same profession. As we can see though, the building is no longer quite as prestigious today, appearing to have fallen into neglect over time, and today serving simply as a historic monument. However, the relics of the grand old Guildhall bring us to an important point about the history of this village. What happened to the port? Well, as we look out towards the sea from this delightful viewpoint, Blakeney's port was initially successful owing to the village's position on the North Norfolk coast, easily reached by trading vessels from Europe, and featuring a natural haven that allowed ships to dock here away from the harsh winds and waves of the North Sea. Unusually, for a period in the 12th and 13th centuries, Blakeney was actually reputed as a hive of piracy, many of the locals even engaging in raids of trading ships that sailed past this part of the coast. It was such a problem, in fact, that many trading ships even refused to dock here for fear of pirates. But that appears to have been stamped out, and the 14th, 15th and 16th centuries came to be the village's greatest period of prosperity. Things only began to decline later on in history because the harbour here began to naturally silt up, creating shallower waters that made it impossible for larger trading ships to dock, destroying the village's historic industry of trade. But in place of that, there came the village that we know today, the waterfront now complete with delightful features such as this purpose-built duck pond, home to just a small part of the wide variety of waterfowl which lives in this area of the Norfolk coast. Opportunities for a spot of bird watching are of course plentiful in this delightful village, and even more so if you head out towards the sea, which you'll find just over a mile away from the quay here. The distance between the North Sea and the village of Blakeney goes to show just how large the haven for ships to dock would have historically been during the local heyday. And while you can still visit the historic harbour a little further out from this point, there are few remnants of the village itself from that era, the Guildhall being by far the oldest landmark in the heart of Blakeney today. Once upon a time there would have stood rows of historic houses, shops and taverns along the quay here, Blakeney's population in the medieval era not much smaller than the 800 or so people who live here today. That figure only refers to permanent residents though, and in the summer season, locals are often outnumbered by visitors, a trend that's led to historic local facilities, like this, the former Blakeney Church Men's Club of 1909, being converted to cater to visitors, now home to a gift shop and an ice cream parlour. This was no accident, of course. The flocks of tourists who've been coming to visit Blakeney over the last 100 years or so are exactly what the villagers were aiming for when trying to halt the period of decline caused by the closure of the port. And while this place can get fairly busy during the height of summer nowadays, its spacious surroundings and calm atmosphere mean that it's still a perfectly pleasant place to visit, nowhere near as crowded as some of the other spots along the North Norfolk coast. However, while the coast holds the keys to much of Blakeney's history, we're now going to make our way inland and take a walk along the village's surprisingly long high street towards the historic parish church, which is nestled in a field in the heart of the beautiful East Anglian countryside. It'll take us about 10 minutes to get there, but on the way we'll pass by many more intriguing local points of interest, such as the historic contraption that's embedded into this stone garden wall. This is Blakeney's village barometer and thermometer, and it was historically used by local fishermen to warn of dangerous weather rolling in over the coast, and hopefully dissuade them from venturing out into the sea. You'll see many similar contraptions in fishing villages all over the country today, many given to coastal communities by the government back in the mid-19th century. Further up the high street here, meanwhile, we've stumbled across the White Horse, a local pub with around 600 years of history. Originally founded back in the 15th century, although rebuilt into its current form in the 17th, the White Horse historically served people passing through Blakeney, either from the sea or across the land. It wasn't just traders and travellers who stopped in the tavern though, because in 1978 a secret smuggler's tunnel was discovered underneath the White Horse, and it led from the pub on the high street here towards the Blakeney Hotel on the quay, which, as we mentioned earlier, was once upon a time the site of the Crown and Anchor Inn. The tunnel was indeed likely used by people smuggling illegal goods into the country from abroad, although many were also probably sneaking back and forth between the two pubs for various nefarious reasons. It's a swashbuckling bit of local heritage that only adds to the mystique of Blakeney's former heyday. To think that what is today a very quaint seaside village was once upon a time a hive of everything from smugglers to pirates and more. Nowadays though, you're most likely to bump into a fellow holidaymaker on a walk around Blakeney. This village, like so many others around the country, home to a large number of holiday homes, which includes many of the houses that we can see here. Now, the houses in Blakeney are all really rather pretty, built of large round stones as is typical across this part of Norfolk, most being cottages built back in the early to mid-19th century. The High Street, historically the main route through the village from the countryside to the sea, is where you'll find the vast majority of these cottages, each with their own illustrious histories. Although in between them you'll also find the odd locally run shop. The Blakeney Delicatessen just here, for example, the perfect place to stop for locally produced food to enjoy as you stroll around the village, though remember to watch out for the seagulls. With a permanent population of only 800 people or so, however, there are of course relatively few shops and other businesses operating in the heart of Blakeney, particularly here away from the tourist-heavy seafront. We will see a few more local businesses as we walk further along the high street here. But what's interesting to note about this village is that, with around 800 inhabitants in the modern day, Blakeney has remained roughly the same size for the best part of 200 years now. While the population of the country as a whole has skyrocketed since the era of the Industrial Revolution, Blakeney's has almost stood still, having been home to 618 people all the way back in 1801, a time when the port was still operating, albeit beginning to decline. The natural silting of the village's deep water harbour began all the way back in the 18th century, and despite efforts to construct new channels through surrounding farmland towards the port, there was little that the local community could do to stop the port's decline, the local customs house eventually closing in 1853, and the local Blakeney Harbour Company finally shutting its doors in the year 1914. As we know, the holiday industry that replaced the old port proved to be quite a success. But let's cast our minds back to the village's true economic heyday, because the role that Blakeney played in medieval-era trade is certainly not to be understated. In the Middle Ages, Blakeney was for a period the home of England's largest harbour of all, a huge haven which could accommodate ships large and small from destinations far and wide. Now, Blakeney's port was of course a major point for the trade of goods, but ships arriving here also brought with them people from all over Europe who wanted to visit this area of Norfolk. These medieval-era tourists weren't coming to Blakeney for a simple day by the sea though. In fact, many arrived here to venture further inland towards the nearby village of Little Walsingham, home to one of the most significant Christian shrines in England. As we look at the village's historic Methodist church here, which is also known as the Pilgrim Church, for centuries in the Middle Ages, the Norfolk village of Little Walsingham, just 7 miles southeast of Blakeney here, was the prime destination for Christian pilgrims in England, home to a shrine dedicated to the Annunciation, and accordingly, a phial of the Virgin Mary's milk. Though also a popular place of pilgrimage in the modern day, nearby Little Walsingham was also a major victim of the English Reformation led by Henry VIII in the 16th century, and as such, Blakeney also saw a fall in people coming through its port on pilgrimages. However, trade, as it had been for centuries beforehand, remained a major feature of local life. And as we mentioned earlier, the bulk of trade here was conducted with the Netherlands, located just over 150 miles across the North Sea from here in East Anglia. In fact, as we look at the gateway to the historic 19th century residence, known as Blakeney House, cross-sea trade with the Low Countries was so regular in this village that you would have been likely to hear nearly as many people speaking Dutch on the streets of Blakeney as you would English, as many sailors and commercial agents spent time on dry land here before heading home. It wasn't just trade with the Dutch that spurred Blakeney's economic heyday, however. In fact, as we pass by the Blakeney Harbour Room, the village's main events venue in the modern day, through the centuries, ships arrived here from ports in northern England, Ireland, Iceland, and many more. But while they brought in pilgrims and a smattering of goods, they also came to Blakeney to gain access to the vast wealth of produce historically cultivated in the fields of East Anglia. For centuries, everything from local wool to East Anglian corn, as well as fish caught in the seas surrounding Norfolk, was much sought after by traders from all over Europe, and this drove the success of this port and a number of others along the Norfolk coast, stretching all the way from Great Yarmouth in the east up to the small villages of Blakeney, Clay, and more up here in the north of the county. The continued prosperity of the port right up until the 18th and 19th centuries helped the village of Blakeney to develop into the wonderful place that we know today. But while the high street today is mainly lined with residential houses, there are still a few more intriguing landmarks dotted around the village's outskirts, which are well worth mentioning, and even visiting if you have the time. As we continue walking further inland towards the village's huge 13th century parish church, this historically significant coastal settlement was once upon a time surrounded by a wealth of major religious sites, no doubt in part due to the proximity to the shrine in nearby Walsingham. We mentioned earlier that further out towards the coast and Blakeney Point, you'll find the remains of a medieval-era monastery, which was originally founded more than 700 years ago in 1296. Now finding ourselves on the main coastal road that passes by Blakeney, just a few yards further along the road in the direction that we're looking now, you'll encounter a small local farm, known as Friary Farm, which of course takes its name from the historic monastery that once existed in this village. Though long since closed after the dissolution of the monasteries in the 16th century, Blakeney's Friary still remains in pieces. In fact, parts of the old monastery were incorporated into what is now the farmhouse, a sparing reminder of the historic religious significance of this coastal village. Interestingly, the farm too is also home to an impressive 18th century windmill, spotting windmills of course being a highlight of any trip around Norfolk. But that's not all there is to see in the local area. Venture a couple of miles to the south of Blakeney and you'll stumble across the remains of Binham Priory, some of the most impressive and most intact remains of any medieval monastery in all of England, originally founded all the way back in the year 1091. Once you've seen the seals and enjoyed the sights of the heart of Blakeney, it's well worth driving or even taking a lengthy walk to Binham Priory. But we won't quite have time to do that on our tour today, because we've now reached the site of the last landmark on our walk. Having strolled more than half a mile through Blakeney, away from the quay where we started out, here we're arriving at the entrance to the village's parish churchyard, in the heart of which there stands the enormous church of St. Nicholas. Now, interestingly, archaeological digs in this area of Blakeney have found evidence of people living, and possibly worshipping here, since as long ago as the Roman and Anglo-Saxon periods. But like the village as a whole, the parish church of St. Nicholas really came into its own around the time of the 13th century. It was in the 13th century that this really rather large church was originally built, although the building that we see today isn't quite as old as that in most places, the vast majority of the stonework dating to the 15th and 16th centuries. Interestingly, if you venture inside the church, you won't just find a beautiful interior, but also a collection of fascinating historic relics, and most intriguingly of all, remnants of graffiti that was scrawled onto the church walls by sailors from as long as 500 years ago. Of course, when docking at Blakeney, pilgrims and sailors would have often made their way to this parish church to worship, possibly praying for a safe journey ahead. Though the church itself was for centuries integral in providing ships with a safe passage into Blakeney's harbour. Unusually, St. Nicholas's here is home to not one, but two church towers, the thinner tower that we can see at the other end of the church, built to serve as a beacon, at the top of which a lantern, visible from the sea, would be lit, signalling to seafarers in the dark that this was the place that they were seeking. The larger main tower is also visible for miles around, particularly across the flat landscape of the surrounding countryside, and so St. Nicholas's really stands out as a symbol of the historic grandeur and significance of what is today a very quiet coastal village, as we've seen. But sadly, having made our way up from the quay, along the high street, and to this point, it's here in the churchyard of St. Nicholas that our walk around Blakeney has reached its end. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed this insight into the main sites and the captivating history of Blakeney. And I hope you're now looking forward to making your own visit to this wonderful Norfolk village sometime soon.